There is something that happens when you read about another species gone, or when you see a before and after image of a glacier, or when a place you loved as a child no longer looks the way it did. It is not quite sadness, not quite anger. It is something slower and heavier than both. A kind of ache that doesn't have a peak and doesn't fully lift, and almost no one in your life has the language for it. This video does. What you have been carrying has a name, and understanding that name is going to change something about the way you've been relating to what you feel. Not by making the feeling smaller, but by making it more honest. Let's stay in the feeling for a moment before we name it. Because the naming matters more if you recognize yourself in the description first. It arrives in specific moments. A headline about a coral system that will not recover. A nature documentary that ends on a note you can't shake for days. A season that doesn't feel like that season anymore, warmer or drier or emptier of the sounds you used to hear. And then there is what happens after the moment. The feeling doesn't resolve. It settles. It becomes part of the background frequency of your days. A low, persistent weight that most people around you don't seem to be carrying at all. You mention something, a species, a fire, a report, and the conversation moves on in about 30 seconds. And you are left holding something that has nowhere to go. That specific experience, the grief that has no landing place, no conversation willing to hold it, no face across the table that signals recognition, that is not incidental to what you're feeling. It is part of the structure of what you're feeling, and it is one of the reasons it is so exhausting to carry. Research has documented this experience with increasing specificity. A 2021 survey published in The Lancet, 10 countries, 10,000 young people, found that more than 68% reported feeling sad, anxious, or grieving about what is happening to the natural world. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not as reassurance, as a more accurate description of how many people are carrying what you are carrying without the language to call it what it is. You are not the only one at the table who feels this. You are, very possibly, the only one at your table who admits it. That is a different thing. And to understand why that gap exists, it helps to look at something most conversations about this feeling skip entirely. There is a concept in grief psychology, developed by researcher Kenneth Doka, called disenfranchised grief. The definition is precise, and it matters. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported, because the loss itself is not recognized by the surrounding culture as something that warrants grieving. It is not that the loss is smaller. It is that the culture has not yet built the containers to hold it. Think about what grief looks like when it has social sanction. There are rituals. There is language. There are people who show up, who ask how you are, who give you permission to be undone for a period of time. The absence of a funeral does not mean there was no loss. But when a loss has no funeral, no ritual, no collective acknowledgement, the grief does not disappear. It becomes privatized, internalized. And then, because you are carrying something that the people around you are not treating as real, you begin to question whether your response is proportionate, whether you are being dramatic, whether something is wrong with you for feeling this way about things that are not people. That self-questioning is not a character flaw. It is what disenfranchised grief does. It compounds the original pain with a second layer, the pain of not being permitted to feel the first one. The word solastalgia was coined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht in 2003. He built it from the Latin solatium, comfort, and the Greek algos, pain. It describes the grief and distress that come from environmental change in a place you call home. The experience of watching your landscape become something you no longer recognize, and feeling that loss as a form of homesickness for a place you have never left. The word exists because the experience was real enough, and documented enough, and shared widely enough, that it required a name. Your grief required a name too. It did not have one. Not because the grief was illegitimate, but because the culture moves more slowly than the loss. Here is the reframe, and it is important to say clearly that this is not reassurance. This is a more accurate description of your actual situation. Ecological grief is not a malfunction. It is not a disorder. It is not disproportionate. It is the emotional registration of real loss. The grief is not the problem. The grief is the accurate response to the problem. There is a version of this feeling that most content treats as a symptom to be managed, something to be processed quickly so you can get back to functioning. That framing is wrong. In a specific way, it locates the difficulty inside you when the difficulty is, in significant part, outside you, in the scale of what has already been lost and in the absence of any cultural structure built to hold that loss honestly. You are not alone in this grief. You are, in many ways, among the first generation of people being asked to carry it at this scale without adequate social support for doing so. That is not nothing. That cost gets named. What this grief is telling you is not that you are broken. It is telling you that you are paying attention, that you have not insulated yourself from the reality of what is happening to the living world, that you have maintained enough openness to let the loss land, which is not a weakness. It is one of the harder things a person can choose to do in a culture that offers many efficient ways to look away. Grief, in this sense, is not the opposite of caring. It is one of the forms caring takes when it has nowhere else to go. Both things are true simultaneously. This grief is painful, and it is also evidence of something intact in you, a capacity for connection to the living world that has not been numbed, managed, or explained away. That combination, the pain and the intactness, is worth holding carefully, not as a burden, as something real. If what this video named is something you want to work with more specifically, not to resolve it, but to learn to carry it with less weight, there is a structured companion in the description built exactly for that. It's a guided workbook designed for people processing climate loss, not as a self-help exercise, but as a serious, honest engagement with grief that deserves to be held. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. So what does it look like to carry this grief without suppressing it and without being consumed by it? Because that is the real question. Not whether the grief is legitimate, but how to live alongside something that does not resolve. The first thing worth knowing, and the research on this is consistent, is that suppressed grief is not more functional than acknowledged grief. The people who attempt to manage ecological pain by not looking at it, by moving quickly past it, by treating it as a distraction from ordinary life, they do not carry less weight. They carry the same weight, plus the energy cost of suppression. Acknowledgement is not indulgence, it is efficiency. One of the things that makes ecological grief particularly hard to hold is that it is global and diffuse. It can attach to everything, which means it can feel like everything is lost. Part of what helps, not as a cure, but as a genuine orientation, is learning to let the grief be specific. Not the planet, but this estuary, this species, this season. Specificity does not shrink the loss. It gives the grief somewhere to live that is more bearable than the weight of the entire world. The second thing worth knowing is that this grief is significantly more bearable when it is shared. Not with people who will redirect you towards solutions or reassure you that things will be fine, but with people who are willing to sit in the same accurate discomfort. Those communities exist. They are small, and they are not loud, and they are not well represented in most social contexts, but they exist. And finding even one person who does not treat your grief as excess changes the weight of it in a way that is hard to overstate. The internal objection worth addressing directly is this one. If I actually let myself feel this fully, I won't be able to function. That fear is understandable, and it is also, the evidence suggests, inverted. What makes grief unmanageable is not acknowledgement. It is unprocessed accumulation. The grief that has been named, sat with, and given some form is more workable than the grief that has been pushed down and shows up as numbness, irritability, or a vague sense that something is always wrong. Grief is not the end of engagement with the world. For many people who carry it consciously, it is one of the reasons the engagement continues. Because grief is, at its core, a form of love that has encountered loss and refused to pretend otherwise. The people doing the most sustained, non-performative work on behalf of the living world are often the people who have allowed themselves to grieve it most honestly. That is not a coincidence. If this opens something you want to take further, the resource in the description was built exactly for that next step, not as a replacement for what's here, but as an extension of it. What was the first moment you realized what you were carrying about the natural world was actually grief, and not just worry, or guilt, or anxiety? Here is where this video actually leaves you. Not with a solution. With something more honest than that. You have been carrying a real form of grief for a real category of loss. Loss that is documented, ongoing, and significant, inside a culture that has not yet built adequate rituals for acknowledging it collectively. That combination, real loss, insufficient containers, is precisely what produces the specific exhaustion of feeling this alone, feeling it quietly, and occasionally wondering whether you are the one whose emotional calibration is off. You are not the one whose calibration is off. What you are is someone whose grief has been disenfranchised, made invisible not by its illegitimacy, but by the slowness of culture to catch up to the scale of what is being lost. That is a meaningful distinction, not as reassurance, as a more accurate description of the situation you have actually been in. The grief belongs in the world. It always did. It was the world around the grief that wasn't ready to hold it, not the grief itself that was out of place. So here's what can be said with precision. To whoever has made it to this part of the video, you are not someone who feels too much. You are someone who has been feeling something real without adequate language, without adequate community, and without adequate cultural permission to call it what it is. That changes now. Not the grief, but the name you have for it. And a grief that has been named is one that can, finally, begin to be held without requiring you to be smaller than you actually are. Imperfect and coherent. Grieving and still here. That is enough. That is, in fact, exactly where this begins.